I'm Nora Lester-Morad. We are here today to learn from Emmaia Gelman, the world's foremost scholar of the history of the Anti-Defamation League, author of the groundbreaking book, The Anti-Defamation League and the Racial State, which is hot off the press from University of California Press. And we're going to hear from Jessie Daniels, also a scholar of the alt-right, the ADL, white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and other topics covered in Emmaia's important book. Without a doubt, this book, The ADL and the Racial State, will bolster a new generation of critical research about the ADL. But more urgently, I believe, in these dangerous times, the book will inspire more activism and more effective activism, starting right here today, because you lovely people will learn, get mad, and get to work, as we know you always do. Since I know you're listening for action steps, which we'll talk about at the end, let me drop on the table for your consideration as you're listening the value and the importance of paying attention and finding out where the ADL is doing its harmful work in your school, your community, your state, and in your media. And make it your business to rile people up, to get the ADL out, or as Emmaia has been known to say, to abolish the ADL. For many of us, abolishing the ADL seems a weird target when there's an actual genocide of Palestinians right now, not to mention urgent threats to migrants and refugees and other vulnerable populations in the United States and around the world. But sit back and let Emmaia explain how all these things are actually connected. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge and to appreciate the badass co-sponsoring organizations of today's event, which include Friends of Sabeel North America, FOSNA, the Institute for the Study of Christian Zionism, the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, Librarians and Archivists with Palestine, and the campaign to drop the ADL from schools. In a minute, because I'm not a multitasker, I will paste short bios of the co-sponsoring organizations in the chat, and I invite you to follow them, support them, and get involved. And no, you don't need to write down the information because our wonderful organizers will email all the information in the chat to you in a follow-up, along with a recording of this event, which you can share. If you don't know me, I'm Nora Lester-Morad, a core organizer with the Drop the ADL campaign, Drop the ADL from Schools campaign. We are an iteration of the 2020 call to #DropTheADL, in which Emmaia was integral, along with other dedicated grassroots activists, many of whom are here today, and which continues to offer analysis and framing and resources at its must-read website, droptheadl.org. The campaign focusing on K-12 schools, which you can find at droptheadlfromschools.org, launched in 2024 with an article called Educators Beware, the Anti-Defamation League is not the social justice partner it claims to be. In Rethinking Schools, the preeminent social justice magazine for teachers in the US. Because while K-12 schools have always been central to the ADL's strategy and reputation, as Emmaia explains in her book, in the chapter devoted to the 1980s, so cleverly titled School Books and Rulers, we've noticed that since the escalation of Israel's genocide of Palestinians in October 2023, the ADL's harm to K-12 education has become even more devastating. Using reputational attacks on individual educators, disproportionately Black and Muslim, and on educators, professional organizations, and unions, and using, quote, lawfare, meaning weaponization of civil rights laws and bad faith Title VI complaints and lawsuits. The ADL and its allies have created an environment of fear in which teaching and learning about Israel and Palestine are dangerous. The ADL's focused attacks on the anti-genocide protesters and on teachers who include Palestinian narratives in the classroom, even while the ADL buddies up with and defends right-wing actors, including blatant anti-Semites, proves what many of us have known. The ADL is not a defender of Jews, it's a defender of Israel, even as it promotes an apartheid, colonial, and genocidal regime on Palestinians. But Emmaia's analysis goes further, is far more nuanced and shocking. And so it's important to our activism. Yes, you might expect that a history of the ADL would shed light on the American Jewish community and Israel, and it does. But Emmaia's book takes the ADL out of its familiar Jewish context, examining the ADL as a product of and a tool for liberalism. Not the liberalism many consider a counterweight to conservatism, but the liberalism that Emmaia says works with conservatism to protect the state from truly liberatory forces. In Emmaia's own words, quote, rather than a Jewish organization, a civil rights organization, or an Israeli advocacy organization, the ADL is a U.S. political institution. Its projects have been to expand state authority and discipline structural epistemological resistance to the state in a much broader sphere. Notably, Emmaia's book shows how the ADL didn't transform from a civil rights organization concerned about fighting bias against all groups to the organization we see today, defending the US and Israeli genocide, supporting the abductions of students who oppose war, defending Elon Musk's Nazi salute, or claiming Black Lives Matters is a threat to Jews. She says the ADL was never that anti-bias group. She says it's settled history in Jewish studies literature that for much of its existence, Jewish communities understood the ADL as a conservative organization, quote, of and for the elite classes, protective of the arrangements of political and economic power in which they were dominant, and resistant to the ideas and movements that challenged those arrangements. But the ADL's reputation as good is well established. It's very, very difficult to question the ADL's fight against hate, including through innocuous sounding programs like No Place for Hate or A World of Difference. What Emmaia argues so brilliantly is that the ADL expanded its anti-defamation and anti-discrimination work intentionally to broadly influence US discourses of state and security, using concepts of hate, terror, and anti-Semitism. She says the ADL's understanding of hate calls for a, quote, intense focus on policing hate rather than redressing the racist, gendered, and often anti-queer violence of institutions like law enforcement itself. This inversion or perversion is clear in the ADL-backed War on Terror, which leverages racist fear and supremacist ideas about morality to present resistors of Israeli and US colonial violence as supporters of hate, terror, and anti-Semitism, and thus anti-democratic and anti-American. If any of this seems confusing, you're not alone. Emmaia says herself in the book that among her motivations for doing this study, quote, I wanted to understand why the ADL invested so heavily in civil rights and at the same time advocated obviously racist and violent projects, including colonial violence and in Palestine and also US-based projects like supporting blanket surveillance of Muslims by New York City Police Department, claiming that they advance Jewish safety and protect democracy. Rather than construe these as contradictions, it seemed important to look for a logic that threaded them together. In doing so, Emmaia produced not only a critical history of the Anti-Defamation League, but a critical history of the United States, especially around contestations over race, rights, belonging, and the legitimacy of violence. First, let's hear from Jessie Daniels. I'll post her longer bio in the chat in a minute to whet your appetite. I'll say, Jessie Daniels, she, they, is a professor who teaches sociology and applied digital sociology at Hunter College at the Graduate Center, CUNY. She's an internationally recognized expert on internet manifestations of racism. She's the author or editor of 6 books. In her first 2 books, White Lies, Routledge, and Cyber Racism, Roman and Littlefield, she offers an intersectional analysis of white supremacy before and after the rise of the popular internet. In 2018, she extended this analysis of white supremacy online in The Algorithmic Rise of the Far Right, in Contexts, an official publication of the American Sociological Association, which has since become one of the most downloaded articles from that journal. In 2019, she was invited to present her research at the UN in Geneva, and her most recent book, Nice White Ladies, The Truth About White Supremacy, Our Role in It and How We Help Dismantle It, received a coveted starred review from Kirkus and was included on their Best Nonfiction of 2021. After Jessie talks about her own history with the ADL, I'll introduce Emmaia, who will speak briefly, and then the 2 speakers will converse with one another before we open up to questions from the audience. Feel free to paste your questions in the Q&A at any time, and we will curate them and present them to the speakers at the end. Remember, there's no need to take notes during the webinar or from the chat because this information will be provided to you. Thank you, by the organizers in a follow-up email. And we will close the session with some action steps and ask you to share action steps among one another, since we're here not only to learn, but to learn so that we can make change. Jessie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Nora. That was really a wonderful introduction to this important new book, and I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to start with a little personal anecdote. Emmaia and I met about 7 years ago in a barn. We were attending a wedding of mutual friends, and someone had said, you know, Emmaia is doing this work that's very critical of the ADL, and I plopped myself down to her, down next to her at the dinner after the wedding and said, okay, what's your argument? And so I'm really gratified to, you know, these many years later, see this argument fleshed out and in this really important new book. I'm someone, as Nora was explaining, who's been researching the far right for about 30 years now, and increasingly that language fails me because I don't know if you can still call it the far right when these views are represented in the current White House. But in that work on researching the far right, I relied on the ADL for statistics, and you can probably find those in both of those early books, White Lies and Cyber Racism. And yet, even as I was calling on the ADL and relying on their statistics, I was always a little hesitant and had some misgivings about it. First, as Emmaia documents in this book, the trend from the ADL is only ever upwards, right, when they're counting incidents of anti-Semitism. And second of all, early on in the 90s, I realized that they were conflating things like violent crimes with things like graffiti. And in so doing, in my view, diminished both any real threat from anti-Semitic actors, and it simultaneously boosted their profile. So I just sort of had these misgivings, but I didn't have enough information to do anything about it. And now with Emmaia's important new book, The Anti-Defamation League and the Racial State, I have much more information and a clearer sense of the ADL's role in American and international politics. As she clearly documents, what the ADL has been really adept at doing is weaponizing their purchase on moral leadership to do the geopolitical and domestic political work of endorsing Israel's genocide and colonial interests so that any critique of that state gets slurred as anti-Semitism. I think this is so important because if we're really going to create a revolution for something better, we have to know who we're fighting with and for, as well as against. Gelman, in my view, has ripped the moral leadership disguise off the ADL and exposed it for the arm of state power that it is. There are 2 points, and this is actually from the chapter that Nora mentioned. There are 2 points just briefly that I want to bring out from that chapter. And one of those is talking about the development of an anti-Klan curriculum that the ADL developed. But when they got pushed to do a more historical and systematic approach to that, this is what happened. So I'm just going to read this one passage from page 195 in the book. To the ADL, this historical, systemic approach to understanding racism directly contravened its insistence that US liberal capitalism was inherently egalitarian and democratic. Worse, it lent support to the left's critique of the US state. Before the anti-Klan curriculum had a chance to roll out, the ADL denounced it for indicting American society as innately racist. And I thought that was so prescient from 1980 to today. It sounds like it could be ripped from the headlines. And then a few pages later, she documents how a group of Quakers from the group, the American Friends Service Committee, which was involved in social justice work and supporting Palestinian rights, wanted to be among the groups involved with the ADL's anti-Klan curriculum, but the Philadelphia ADL director flatly refused their inclusion. So I thought that that was a very important and telling sort of story from that chapter. I want to end by adding 2 points just about how we approach this book, because I think it can be very challenging. And Nora sort of alluded to this in the beginning. Reading this book to me was sort of like experiencing what Naomi Klein referred to as going through into the mirror world, where up is down and down is up. And I just want to name that as part of the psychic intrusion, which Shihai and Shihai in their psychoanalysis under occupation have documented, is part of what Zionism creates. And the ADL has really honed that. It's meant to confuse and disorient us. So I just want to affirm that and validate it for anyone who's wading into this material feeling unsure. And the second thing is that there is a kind of moral injury in the realizations in this book, especially for someone who, like me, who has bought into the propaganda that the ADL was selling. And so that can be hard to process as well, and it can lead to some defensiveness. So I just want to name those things and help you be aware of your own responses and ask you to be gentle with yourself as you go through this material if it's new, which I'm sure it's not for anyone on this call. Okay, that's what I wanted to say in the opening, and I'm going to turn it over to Nora to introduce Emmaia.
Thank you. That was amazing, and I really appreciate your reminder that those of us who may have been confused or bought in somehow to the ADL because we didn't know, we need to be a bit gentle, but then also then to be harsh, right? And to move on to our business of getting the ADL out of the institutions that we care about, which are important for democracy. Okay, I'm looking for Emmaia's amazing bio, and here it is. Emmaia Gelman is the author of this book, The Anti-Defamation League and the Racial State, a critical history of the Anti-Defamation League as a Cold War neoconservative institution. University of California Press, 2026. And the co-editor of the forthcoming The Anti-Defamation League, A Critical Reader, coming out later this year by Pluto Press. She co-hosts the amazing podcast Unpacking Zionism. She's a co-chair of the American Studies Association on academic and community activism and a longtime activist in New York City. She's founding director of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism, which examines the political and ideological work of Zionist institutions in Palestine and transnational contexts. She researches the history of ideas about race, queerness, safety, and rights, and their production as levers of surveillance, quote, anti-terror and war. Her teaching spans academic and community spaces. I attest to that. Emmaia, take it away.
Thank you so much to everybody who organized this, and to Nora and Jessie for reading the book. Now there are at least 2 people in the world who have read the book, and for your support and encouragement. And thanks to everybody for joining. This is actually kind of an exciting opportunity to have a conversation about the book that I haven't yet been able to have. Lots of people want to talk about this as a Jewish history. I want to talk about it as a history of race and racism in the United States and a driver of genocide. And this opportunity to talk about it in terms of Christian Zionism and conservatism is actually hasn't yet been on the radar, and I'm very glad to be able to do that with you. The ADL's history is sort of sprawling, and we have to focus on one chunk at a time. So thank you for this. I'm going to try and keep my remarks to 20 minutes, and anybody can feel free to wave at me or like cut off my mic or whatever. We might know the ADL as a civil rights organization, although that seems sort of increasingly unlikely. But in fact, its history demonstrates that it's a right-wing organization. And, the language of a right-wing organization is difficult because it presumes like there is a right and left, and that that the United States has that kind of division. And actually, as we're seeing right now in the present, as organizations and political actors support the genocide of Palestinians by the Israeli state and call it a sort of liberal or like a democratic or centrist position, I think it correctly challenges our notions of right and left. So when I say that the Anti-Defamation League is a conservative organization or right-wing organization, I mean conservative in the sense of defending the state, right? Trying to keep things as they are, preserve the status quo. And in the United States, the status quo that it aims to preserve is capitalist and individualist, and also settler colonial, and all that means. And the ADL's origins are in that moment, like a very concrete moment in U.S. history when the formation of citizenship and the identity of people who were participating in building the state was overtly settler. It was about like actually expropriating indigenous land, dispossessing indigenous people, killing indigenous people, right? And forging an identity as a citizenry and a state that was against that. And additionally, and forged the sort of national identity and subject identity was forged against slavery, right? Like who is not a slave? And in the field of American studies, which is where I come from, that these are sort of origin points, right? Like U.S. identity is formed in the context of settler colonialism and slavery as not indigenous and not Black. And our conversations about the ADL have to begin there, I believe. I'll come to that. I'll come back to that in just a second. But so the history of the ADL shows that consistently since its origins in 1913, that it has been anti-communist, opposed to the Jewish left and the Black left and other forms of left, opposed to Arab anti-colonialism beginning in the 40s, whether Arab anti-colonialism was positioned as a left movement, like an anti-colonial movement, or whether it was coming from a perspective of sovereignty and states, which is not a particularly left framing, right, but is still anti-colonial resistance against British and then European Jewish colonialism. So the ADL has always been those things. It was founded as an organization not of all Jews, and certainly not of the Jews who we sort of in narrative and storytelling identify as the foundational group that forged U.S. Jewry. So that sort of mythology, which is the origin story of my family in the U.S. and so many other people's families, is Jews getting off a boat at Ellis Island, fleeing pogroms, fleeing the Tsar, and anti-Semitism in Eastern Europe. But the ADL and the American Jewish Committee and the Jewish Federations, which are the network of charities that have largely funded institutional Jewish life in the United States, were founded earlier, or founded by a group of immigrants who had arrived earlier, rather, who were upper class, German Jews, considered themselves European, appreciated what they thought of as high European culture, including its colonial and racial supremacist sort of foundations, and were capitalists and interested in that, and identified themselves as members of this sort of settler and racial state. And the organizations were formed to control and discipline the later immigrants who came who did not conform to those ways of being, to those ideas, to those cultural norms, and were both embarrassing to the German Jewish immigrants and also, as they understood it, threatened the state order, the whiteness, the capitalism, and the sort of elitism of the state order. So they formed these organizations, which, we can talk about them being formed at the moment of immigration, or we can talk about them being formed at the turn of the century. I find it helpful to think of them in the context of the other organizations that were also emerging at that time, progressive era organizations. These were organizations dedicated to what they called social hygiene. Partly they were about supporting immigrants who had arrived and who were poor and who needed food and housing, and addressing the kind of what they saw as the depravities of newly industrialized life in cities, people living too close together, families, like lacking structure, kids being sent to work, etc. But social hygiene was essentially a way of conceiving of state order and was closely linked to eugenics. It's not strange that these were organizations that set out to discipline people in the interest of the state. These origins help explain why it was so easy for the Anti-Defamation League to move more fully into anti-communism, which it did. It became a fully anti-communist Cold War organization at the end of World War II, and why they were able to move into supporting the imperialist racism that emerged at the same time. The idea of extending US and Western influence and dominance around the world, opposing communism, insisting that capitalism and US-style individualism was actually the way to produce democracy and racial equality. These have their origin points much earlier. They don't constitute a shift. It's important to understand that the ADL, although it purported to be an anti-Semitism organization, held these positions and these beliefs even when they constituted attacks on Jews. So, for example, in 1916, the leader of the ADL declared communist Jews to be apostates against the liberty and freedom that constituted the American religion. In 1938, they published a book called Hitler's Communism Unmasked, which declared that there was no such thing as a Jewish communist, and that, in fact, although the accusations of communism were being used by Hitler and by Nazis as a way to target Jews, that the ADL was not going to oppose that in any way, because anyone who said they were a Jewish communist was already an apostate. And in the 1950s, we saw that again, where the ADL, along with the American Jewish Committee, advocated for the execution of Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, who were two Jewish leftists who had been accused of selling secrets to the Soviet Union. The ADL refused to support the efforts to sort of address the anti-Semitism that was fueling their prosecution, and it endorsed their execution. And then shortly afterward, continued with other major Jewish organizations to purge all leftists from any kind of Jewish communal life or funding. So the ADL's interest in opposing anti-Semitism did not extend to all Jews, and in fact, its anti-leftism has been more central than its anti-Semitism. Its imperial racism is less discussed. The anti-left, anti-Jewish stuff is, as Nora mentioned, settled history in Jewish studies and Jewish history books, even though we don't really remember it in our sort of popular conceptions of history. But the ADL's imperial racism has not really been on the radar. So I want to just explain it a little bit. It's also the link to the Christian right here, really. In 1993, the ADL was raided. Its offices were raided by the FBI. And what the FBI found was that the ADL, the raid was prompted by some publication in an ADL report of material on the Nation of Islam that the FBI recognized as classified documents from their own files. So they raided to see like what else was there and why. And what they found was that the ADL had been spying on a whole host of organizations. It had been spying on groups that might have been expected to be on its radar at the time, including organizations opposing South African apartheid because Israel had trade relations with South Africa and was under pressure for those. It had been spying on Black liberation groups, which was to be expected because the ADL had targeted Black liberation, calling it anti-Semitic and racist when it tried to, address capitalism. It had files on skinhead groups, which is sort of how we popularly understand what the ADL does, and some less expected groups that was spying on the ACLU, for example, sort of organizations that you might have thought were its allies. But also in those files, it turned out that the ADL was spying on a whole bunch of organizations that worked in the United States to support Central American and Filipino leftist movements, or and also in Central America, the leftist governments that had succeeded in producing revolutions. And the fact that the ADL was targeting these organizations as enemies. Before I move on, I want to say also that the ADL was, of course, spying on Arab American organizations and Palestine solidarity groups. I didn't put them in there because it's so obvious, but it is important to note that the ADL's spy had been so deeply integrated into the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee that he was running some of their security at the time in 1986 when the Jewish Defense League, a Zionist extremist organization, bombed the offices and murdered the director, Alex Ode, of that organization. And there's a film out that's just about to be distributed by Watermelon Pictures called "Who Killed Alex Ode," which is important to watch and understand as part of this history. The fact that the ADL had been spying on these Central America and Philippines focused organizations points to a whole history of neoconservative connections that has really been under-historicized. And even in the book, there's a whole chapter on it in the book. And even there, I feel there's so much more research that needs to be done. In 1967, the Anti-Defamation League it was working to expand its surveillance unit. We generally know its surveillance unit as tracking white nationalist organizations because that's its most publicized work. But it was looking to sort of formalize its surveillance unit. And to do that, it hired several members of the anti-communist wing of the Socialist Party USA. That might seem small. They were sort of a cadre of activists who had worked together for a long time. The Socialist Party didn't survive the end of the 60s and early 70s. It split over the Vietnam War, over whether or not to support or oppose the Vietnam War. Now, if you haven't heard of leftist organizations considering supporting the Vietnam War, that's because the groups that did, the factions that did, became neoconservative. They left the left. But they were part of this trajectory of people who moved from left to right out of disillusionment with the 60s and out of disillusionment with the idea of, that civil rights should be more than simple egalitarianism and formal equality, treating everybody the same, but in fact should make deeper interventions like affirmative action being a sort of anodyne one. And they also split with the left over the question of whether or not U.S. imperialism was a good idea. The reason that neocons who moved out of the left endorsed U.S. imperialism was because they saw U.S. culture as a critical, or Western culture, I guess, as a critical foundation for any kind of democracy. And they saw opposing communism, as the US was doing, as the CIA was doing, as a critical foundation for any kind of democracy. This philosophy became sort of crystallized in the program called Democracy Promotion, which was the US intervention in places like Central America and the Philippines and South Africa that tried to promote capitalism, capitalist unions, pro-US civic organizations as a sort of grassroots soft power resistance to the left. So, for example, in South Africa, one project that was undertaken in that vein, in the democracy promotion vein, was to create capitalist unions who could pose a counterweight to Marxist labor organizations that were trying to fight apartheid. So the ADL became a home for some of these organizations, and the other members of the Socialist Party kind of right-wing faction who were very close with them moved into other organizations, including the leadership of neoconservative institutes at the AFL-CIO, which was very closely engaged in soft power projects with the CIA at that time, the American Enterprise Institute, JINSA, the Jewish Institute for the National Security of America, I think it's called now. It's recently changed its name. And organizations like the National Endowment for Democracy, also pro-Demca, which may be on your radar. So these neoconservative organizations became, between the 60s and let's say the 80s, formed a network that included the ADL that was propagating neoconservative ideas and policies. In the 1980s, these became more visible as the ADL's own director began to advocate for developing relationships with the Christian right, abandoning what he called the Jewish instinct for liberalism. He wrote, this is Nathan Perlmutter in his book, The Real Anti-Semitism in America, which is 1982, where he says, Jews can live without abortion. Jews can live with prayer in the schools. We don't need to fight on those matters anymore. What we can't live without is Israel and Western supremacists. I didn't say supremacists, but Western domination, essentially, of the rest of the world. And so we need to be allied with the Christian right in order to support this. You can see in that era that the ADL takes up relationships with some of the most conservative Christian organizations and figures at the time. It had a particularly close relationship with Cardinal Law. It also worked in the Reagan White House had an Office of Public Diplomacy, which invited evangelical Zionist and right-wing organizations to help develop sort of narrative about why it was good for human rights to support dictatorships in Central America. The ADL took up Latin American issues directly in some cases. It was particularly involved in the case of Nicaragua, where a group of supporters of the failed Somoza regime lodged complaints that the Sandinistas, the Marxist government, were anti-Semitic and had expropriated Jewish land and taken over a Jewish community center because they were anti-Semitic. And they toured the United States, supported by the ADL and also the Reagan administration, to make this case. It turned out, as a group of Jewish leftists went to Nicaragua to sort of verify that what had happened was that these were Somoza supporters. They were business people who had been sort of fueling the Somocista resistance to the current government, and as a result, they had been treated as enemies of the state, and their businesses, I don't know, shut down. But it wasn't because they were Jewish, obviously. So this is the kind of work that the ADL undertook as a neoconservative organization, doing sort of this international work for the United States. And we can see that, we don't have time to discuss now, but we can understand its positions on South Africa through the same lens. For a long time, the ADL defended the Israeli state's relationship with the South African apartheid regime, partly because the opposition to the apartheid regime was the left. It wasn't necessarily solely about the connection between Palestine, between the PLO and the South African resistance. It was also simply about opposing the left. Similarly, the campaign to free Soviet Jewry, which was such a broad-based and widespread campaign from the 70s through the 90s, was framed as a civil rights struggle, the struggle to allow Soviet Jews to freely leave the Soviet Union, but in fact was part of a larger neoconservative strategy to portray the Soviet Union as repressive and anti-Semitic, and also provide support to the right-wing organizations around the world that were participating in this supposed, sort of pro-democracy program. This was often cloaked in the language of civil rights and human rights, or about opposing anti-Semitism, and always included the denunciation of the left and resistance movements. Understanding the ADL's history as a trajectory of sort of always right-wing and conservative action, and always partnering with right-wing organizations, right-wing administrations, makes understanding what's happening now much easier. It's much less confusing to look at the ADL, which appears to have turned to the right, right? It's embraced MAGA. It had two MAGA pastors as featured speakers at its 2026 Never Is Now Anti-Semitism conference. It has excised its own research on white nationalist groups from its website, and it is doing its very best to ignore any kind of anti-racist, anti-genocide, or other civil rights demand that doesn't conform to these politics. These are not divergences from its history. Its history has always shown that it's interested in what Marco Rubio recently called at the Munich Security Conference, the defense of Western civilization. Against whom? Against the uncivilized East, against Muslims, against the world that opposes colonialism, against the decolonizing world, against the domestic, like inside the United States, anti-racist and anti-Zionist movements, against Jews who oppose Zionism and the State of Israel, and now increasingly against those who oppose the sort of shift to AI and tech-fueled governance and surveillance, because those two are instantiations of state power and Western supremacism that the ADL is interested in protecting. And we hear the language of this whenever the ADL calls the anti-genocide movement terrorist or terror supporting, and whenever it calls anti-Zionism Soviet, which it often does. So it's important to sort of grapple with the ADL as on a permanent trajectory of opposition to the left, and opposition to the left specifically in defense of Western supremacism. And then it's much less confusing.
Great. Thank you so much. So that's all very illuminating. I have a couple of questions for you. There's a brief and parenthetical mention of your family's connection to this history on page 32, for those of you following along at home. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit more, not necessarily about your family, but just how you came to the topic of this book. Like, I mean, there are so many things that you could have written about. Why this book and this topic?
Probably multiple reasons, but the sort of pullouts are, I mean, of course, I don't think of it as a Jewish book, but my encounter with the ADL is certainly because I come from a Jewish family and was told always that we were sort of in the civil rights camp. I would go so far as to say that for a middle to upper class New York Jews who are clearly white and but also sort of tuned in to issues of race and social justice, that having this idea of ourselves as being participants, sort of, like historical genetic participants in the civil rights movement, is a way of distancing ourselves from white privilege and covering white privilege. So it was, whether I understood it or not, I think that framing of Jewishness was very important to me. And when I came to understand, first of all, when I came to understand that I was white, like it didn't matter that I was Jewish, like I was definitely white and was not going to be able to get away from that, and that I had been enjoying white privilege and the fruits of racism for my whole life, that was jarring to me, and it forced me to question not only what was I really, but also why had I thought that, and why had I been taught that. And the ADL is, of course, central in producing that narrative. The second thing that made me focus on the ADL was that when the movement for gay marriage kicked off, and critiques of it, which I found very, compelling, included that this call for marriage as a civil right, as a way for queer people to experience citizenship, was partly, not entirely, but partly based on the idea that we should be able to transfer wealth to each other.
Yeah.
And the idea of demanding a civil right that allows us the ability to like really lock down the benefits of racial capitalism didn't sit right with me, And I don't no reason. And I came to understand, I mean, first of all, it was so clearly parallel to the way that Zionists talked about
Mhm.
Israel as producing a civil right. Like, how can you produce a civil right that it does violence to other people on the same basis?
Right.
So this claim seemed strange to me, and it
Mhm.
turned out upon, just a tiny bit of further investigation that the ADL was also the model for
Mhm.
queer rights organizations in the 80s and 90s. So I needed to understand, like, what is it about this framework of liberal civil rights that allows us to make these demands to empower people who already hold power, right?
Mhm.
And then call it a matter of justice. And the ADL just turned out to be at the center of it.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is, as you so eloquently describe in the book. So I mentioned this chapter that Nora also mentioned, which I think is relevant for this audience, about school books and rulers, the 1980s. And this is just before I entered the chat of this organization and the work that they were doing. But I was really intrigued by this whole development of an anti-Klan curriculum, and then the refusal of the Quakers to join that effort. So I just wonder if you could paint a little bit more context on that story, and of course correct me if I got anything wrong, which is possible.
No, you do. The ADL's education empire, which I think we have to call it an education empire, um, was it formed in a moment and like through the opportunity of a moment
Mhm.
when people in the United States were very tuned into racial violence and worried about it. It was the end of the 70s, beginning of the 1980s, the rise of the Klan, the return of soldiers from the Vietnam War, lots of economic frustration, right? And the question was, like, what's going on and how can we try and ameliorate this racist violence and these divisions in US society? The ADL was able to step in with curriculum as it had in the 50s when the concern of the nation was like, how do we get people to not be Nazis, right? How do we get people to abandon biological racism? The ADL stepped in with curriculum, and because of the urgency of the moment, there was a hunger for that kind of curriculum. And so it was able to propagate it. But the ADL was also doing other projects, as it always has been. Every single, every instance of its history, there's more than one project going on. And the other project that's always kind of behind the curtain is the support of the state, of the US state, and to some extent the Israeli state. The curriculum that the ADL was trying to propagate was in the service of these sort of liberal and anti-radical understandings of what race and racism were. So racism is a sort of bad thoughts about other people. Um, there's a sort of at the center of the ADL's conception of a not racist society is the idea kind of that everybody acts white. It's not articulated, but it's a sort of a widely recognized white supremacist approach to egalitarianism. And um, and it was also a way to assert the centrality of the ADL's idea of anti-Semitism, which is that anti-Semitism and leftism are the same,
Yeah.
that anti-colonial movements are anti-Semitic inherently.
Mhm.
The curriculum that the ADL managed to propagate, which is called The World of Difference, as Nora mentioned, was actually not its first. Its first curriculum that had been published in 1982 directly in response to the anti-Klan curriculum as a way to like try and sideline it. And that
Mhm.
curriculum is pretty eye-popping. It's a 300-page curriculum. The first half of it is dedicated to explaining why white nationalism is bad. The second half of it is dedicated to showing teachers how to lead students to believe to the conclusion that Marxism and any kind of like leftist movement that uses elements of it is extremist and leads directly to totalitarianism. I mean, it was like directly out of 1950.
Hmm.
That that curriculum was kind of smoothed over and modified a bit to become a world of difference. But of course, the idea that local groups would want to participate in order to raise the issues that they were experiencing, what didn't sit well. It was the American Friends Service Committee was forbidden. They were actually having a much longer fight with the ADL at the time. They were denied entry to it. Queer organizations in the Bay Area were kind of like brought in pretending, the ADL sort of pretended to include them, and then when they actually had something to say about it, they were excluded. Um, uh, Japanese American organizations were brought in, and then when they had critiques about the way that the curriculum minimized internment experiences, they were bounced. And Iranian and other, I think, Arab American organizations were had the critique that the ADL's version of like "don't be racist against Middle Eastern people" was basically like they want to be in the United States and you should welcome them, like if because they've rejected their home cultures and countries. So it was a very tightly curated curriculum. But because school districts were hungry for it, and I would venture to say largely run by white people, it was accepted widely and had become ubiquitous.
Yeah, it's very helpful for me, especially because I hope to teach this book in the fall, and one of the things when I'm teaching students about how we combat the far right is they kind of always and quickly jump to education. Well, we just need more education, and it's like
Mm.
put a pin there. Let's come back to it because this is actually a terrain of contestation. This education,
Sure. I mean, the far right is making a move right now with Zionist organizations to use the idea that there's a crisis of anti-Semitism and a crisis of civility
Yeah.
on college campuses to promulgate programs that say that they're about civil discourse, but in fact do exactly what we've been trying to combat all this time, which is demand both sidesing, right? Say that when people are opposed to genocide, that they must be in, respectful conversation with people who endorse genocide, and requiring college students to go through these programs as a way to, ostensibly be
Yeah,
able to participate in public conversations. So terrain, absolutely, education continues to be right-wing terrain.
absolutely.
Can I ask you a question, Jessie?
Please go ahead.
I have learned so much from you about the study of white nationalism and the study of hate. Um, and that's actually, I mean, I didn't really understand how hate discourse was working until I started understanding that the ADL had used it to hide away other kinds of anti-racism, essentially to hide away more radical approaches and redistributive approaches to anti-racism. That the ADL did that in the 80s and 90s through legislation and policy, sort of introduced the idea of hate as an area of policing. But later, as I learned from you, that discourse became a field of hate studies, which has kind of done what often Zionist projects do, which is provide a sort of scholarly framework, scholarly veneer that normalizes and naturalizes ideas that have been kind of introduced for the purpose of actually obscuring real conversations. So the ADL itself is being destabilized right now. Its statistics are being questioned, right? But hate studies and in fact, the entire discourse of hate and hate crimes seems to be just as persistent as ever. Partly, I think it appeals to people because it's a way of describing what's happening to them in a sort of a way that has immediacy. So,
Mhm.
can you talk about hate studies
Yeah.
and its meaning and how we should think about it as we're trying to combat right-wing incursions?
Yeah, I think for me the whole idea of hate studies as a field from my perspective right now, is kind of a field in disarray. I was at a conference in the spring of 2022, and it was billed as an international conference, but it was actually quite regional and quite small, which is another indication that I don't think it's as robust as we might think from the outside. But and there were a lot of tensions in the uh, between the panel and the panelists that I observed at that time. And I think one of the biggest ones was these issues that you've highlighted about state power and about whiteness. And I'll just give you two quick examples from that conference. So one of the panels that I attended at that conference was about what to do. It was somebody releasing a report. I can't remember the name of the report now, but it was a report about what to do basically when white supremacists come to your town. And these researchers had spent a lot of time putting this together, and somebody, once they had done their presentation, somebody from the back of the room raised their hand and said, I'm from a small town in northern Idaho, and for people who've paid attention to this for as long as I have, that that's a place where there are a lot of white supremacists. They've relocated there to make that their sanctuary land or whatever. And she said, we had a group of these white supremacists who were doing a march through town. And when we went to the police were like, they seem fine to me. I don't see any threat there. And so her question to the panelist who had done this report was, what do I do when the police and the white supremacists are the same people? And there was this kind of deafening silence in the room. Could have heard a pin drop. And they were like, and they hemmed and hawed and said, well, actually, when we put this report together, we had a long discussion about what to do about the police. Like, do we include them as part of the problem in this report, or do we leave them out? And if we wanted to get this report distributed, we knew that we would have to not be critical of the police. I just thought, oh, that's what we're doing. We're pointing to all kinds of, hate, problems with hate, but not including the police. And it's something I've come across in my work over and over again, and trying to talk about, the overlap between the police, the military, and these far right groups. And, oftentimes it's a Venn diagram that just looks like a circle. But there's no way to talk about that within the field of hate studies, for just the reasons that you point out, because they're very interested in a kind of individual, this is a personal prejudice kind of framework for talking about these. So much so that at another panel at this conference that I attended, there was a scholar presenting her work on how we shouldn't use formers, that is, people who are formerly in white supremacist groups, as experts. And it was quite controversial, that paper, because people were like, yes, but they're the experts and we should be drawing on them. And one of the things that presentation and the response to it made me realize was the way that whiteness is circulating within the field of hate studies. Almost everyone at that conference I went to, the International Conference on Hate Studies, was a white person. And that immediately always makes me suspicious. It's like, well, whiteness is working here. What's happening, right? And part of what I began to realize was that there's a way in which it's a group of researchers who are white, who are then pointing to the bad white people, right? We're the good white people because we're the researchers in hate studies, and those are the bad white people over there. And how do we control them using state power? So I actually don't know what's going on in the field, the bigger field of hate studies right now. The Journal of Hate Studies was dormant for a couple of years, and it's just coming back now. But the direction of it is unclear. But I think that your book is really clarifying about how hate then collapses into terror, and that gets mobilized with state power. I mean, we're seeing it in real time now with the current administration over and over again. Any enemy of the state is a terrorist, according to them. So, and this is just another iteration of that. So,
okay,
great.
so then I have a short follow-up question.
Yeah,
I know we want to get to lots of other questions. So I think that the sort of mobilization of whiteness in this, I mean, it's sort of, there are close parallels. The ADL is very like up in the hate space, and the mobilization of whiteness is very much about that. And the idea that, of Jewish safety is sort of filled with notions that we should be safe, and, the expectations that I would say are very white expectations of safety. Mm-hmm. Can you just, now I want to, I mean, like, obviously we have to always sort of recenter, like bring ourselves back to Palestine and to the genocide as we're talking about this. So can you just sort of make the connection for us? Like, how is this enabling and driving genocide? How do we put these two things together?
Yeah, easy question. So I think that for me, the way that it does that is it centers whiteness again, and so it distracts us from the work that whiteness is doing and that state power is doing in the genocide of Palestinian people, right? And this, I mean, this plays out in my day-to-day at the institution that I work at, where even in conversations about what kind of books I'm going to assign, I assigned the Palestine Laboratory in one of my classes and had a colleague, object to that and say, you can't assign that book because that's not a place. I was just like, what are you even saying? So I think that there is a way in which talking about hate is a way that moves us away from the ongoing genocide that's happening. And also this language of extremism, which is often used to talk about white supremacists, to talk about terrorists, I think is another way that it collapses really easy into an endorsement of liberalism. And it's really emblematic of how left and right, that binary doesn't work anymore, which you so well point out in your book. But I think we have to really talk about power and who is being destroyed by that power. And we've, watched on our screens for the last 2.5 years how the Palestinian people have been destroyed, and now moving into Lebanon, the same playbook is going on again. So, I mean, I think that's the real point of looking at power, is who's benefiting and who's being destroyed by it.
Thank you.
I want to ask a follow-up question too. I don't want to take it away from your amazing conversation, but the general theoretical and academic framework you're talking about, hate, is so useful, but can you bring it down to like how this plays out in schools, which obviously is something I care very much about. When a parent or an educator or a student sees a program that says no place for hate, we don't want a place for hate, right? That's good. No place for hate. That's a good thing, because hate is a bad thing, right? We don't seem to have the language to describe what we think, not only what we think is wrong about that framework, but what framework we actually want. And the reason why I think that's important, and I want to hear from you both about it, is because this is where the not just the anti-Palestinian racism and the pro-Israel politics pull together, but it's also where there's potential for, Black studies and queer studies and other studies, anti-colonial studies, to dovetail. In other words, I think that in schools sometimes the issue of the ADL's work is siloed in a Jewish and Palestinian space wrongly, and therefore not only are the convergences of the problem invisibilized, but the opportunity for solidarity are also invisibilized. So I guess I wanted to hear a little bit from either or both of you about that in a practical way.
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure that I would. Now, I don't have small children at home, so, grain of salt, there could be people with young children have a better answer for this, but I don't think that no hate is actually the message that we want to put forward. I mean, it's sort of like my colleague Linda Alcoff has argued that the phrase that anti-racism is a negative, and it's hard to rally people behind something that we're against, right? That we need something that we're all for. And in a way, I mean, not to pedestalize a politician, but I think this is kind of the magic of Mayor Mamdani, is he's not been sort of, we're against that, we're for, fast and free buses. What is it that you're for? So, I mean, I think it's the lesson of Audre Lorde, that we learn to appreciate each other across differences. I think that we have to talk in that kind of what we are what we want to create, what we want to see in the world, rather than what we're against. Because I think putting it in terms of what we're against, it just too easily collapses into this other thing, you know, where we're making enemies out of other human beings. And I think that's not helpful. I mean, Emmaia, I'm sure you have a better take on that than I do.
It's really tough. I do have kids in school, and I will tell you that it is really it's it takes a real school leader to a strong school leader with like a, confidence and a sense of themselves to resist the invitation to use the ADL as a source. And it's for, it's because this is like it's so easy to get canceled, right? It's so easy to like mount a smear campaign that says like the school refused to deal with XYZ. The ADL is sort of pre-approved as a partner of the state, and it checks a box, it doesn't do anything. Like, Nora has very clearly demonstrated in her research that the ADL's interventions in schools don't actually shift any kind of like racist interactions or tensions. And often they mask things, right? Because the ADL, for example, and I'll just get real personal. In my kids' school, there was a swastika that was written on a bathroom door. And of course, the New York City law requires that the police be called now when there's a swastika. And of course, that sort of is a direct line to the ADL or whatever sort of ADL-like organizations exist. But in fact, the swastika was paired with text that was racist. It like anti-Black racist. It said, "I hate Black people," I think. So like, what is the ADL doing there? Well, it's just ticking a box, right? It's not solving the problem. It takes it takes a strong leader and actually probably a strong parent body to resist that. So our job, I think, is to we have to dethrone the ADL a bit. And now I don't think that happens in the context of schools because that kind of courage and political capital is difficult. We have to support schools to make that shift. But where the change needs to happen, I think, is in the press. Because as long as the ADL continues to be platformed as the arbiter of anti-Semitism and the holder of data, it's really difficult for organizations that don't hold political power to break with them. I think Nora's going to put in the chat a call to sign on to a letter that asks major media organizations to stop using the ADL as a neutral source. I'll just add one more thing, which is another reason that the press is so important is that the ADL is not a membership organization. The ADL doesn't care that Jews all over the United States are saying it doesn't represent us. Because its support comes from mega donors and its ability to get platformed in politics and press. So if we want to dethrone it, we have to work there.
I love that. And then I just want to make an additional connection for people because schools are so important, like in society. Is that the ADL has a very close relationship with law enforcement, quote, law enforcement with police, right, in schools and outside of schools. So more and more, the ADL calls the police when there is that swastika on the fourth grade bathroom wall. The police are called. The police are not called for the N-word or for anti-trans comment. They're called for swastikas or anti-Jewish comments. And so the ADL gets called, they bring in the police, or the police get called and they bring in the ADL, and it becomes another kind of parallel school to prison pipeline where a child is now labeled as, because this is a hate crime. Graffiti is a crime and hateful graffiti is a hate crime. So you have like criminalization of, I would call, bad behavior, but also age-appropriate behavior that deserves a pedagogical and restorative response in schools. And that's the job of schools. The schools then outsourcing their response to the ADL and to the police in a way that exceptionalizes anti-Semitism and also exceptionalizes Jews. So much more to talk about, but we do have some questions from others. I could talk to you all day, obviously. And then we want to save a few minutes at the end also to talk about action steps. So in terms of questions, there are too many and they're all great. So let's start with If you could say a bit more about how your work about the ADL intersects with LGBTQ justice and also if you could expand on what the ADL example tells us about single issue politics versus multi-issue coalition politics.
Small question. Okay. Thanks for that question. It's actually super helpful right now, especially. So the ADL's model of sort of elevating individual instances of hostility as the subject of policing, like making that the way that we experience being part of the state, right? Like, oh, queers have citizenship because the police can now be called to prosecute violence against us, right? That's an extremely narrow, limited, and I would say carceral way of thinking about our citizenship and our lives. The ADL already did that to Jewishness. In 1974, the ADL published the book called The New Anti-Semitism, which responded to the fact that ADL leaders had essentially determined that anti-Semitism in the US was done. It was resolved. And yet they wanted to make sure that people saw Israel as an issue that they needed to support because it was a Jewish interest. And they also wanted to make sure that people opposed the left, which they also identified as a Jewish interest. So the new anti-Semitism elevated the idea that anti-Semitism was anything that opposed state interests. And then it sort of began to fuel in 1979, the audits of anti-Semitic incidents. After that, if you look at newspaper coverage of Jewish life, any discussion of anything having to do with Jewish life, but that's not anti-Semitism, diminishes basically to zero. And coverage of anti-Semitism goes through the roof. The same thing happens essentially to queer life, right? Like if in the moment of counterculture and the sort of emergence of the idea of like, throwing off gender roles and gender diversity, the idea of queer life is expansive. It's like, we don't have to live in this box. We can look at other ways of organizing our lives. We can think about like, what does work mean? What does it mean to experience love, right? And when you reduce everything to discrimination against you, then your whole identity is sort of reformulated around grievance and the idea that you want to be protected by the state against whatever. It's so destructive, right? It's so destructive. I feel that, Zionism has destroyed my family and my life, my sort of ability to experience Jewishness as a whole person. And similarly, I would say that the ADL's interventions, not alone, obviously, have kind of destroyed queerness as well. In the present, obviously, pinkwashing is a huge part of the way that pinkwashing and homo nationalism, right, are a huge part of the way that states use queerness to assert that they're good, right, because they allow queers to be citizens in particular ways, or because the army wears, fucking rainbow helmets or whatever. And those are extensions of the same problem.
There's something familiar that when in the old like discussion about like women are now in the army and like, okay, now women have arrived because women are in the army. They get to like kill people like men, right? Not to oversimplify, but there are a couple of questions that relate to, I'm going to combine them. The ADL's relationship with Israel, and maybe by extension to that, there's a hard question about how to speak with people who still call themselves or think of themselves as liberal Zionists. And I think those two things are related.
The ADL's relationship to Israel is both structural and not. One of the things that's so hard about identifying how the ADL works is that some of it is like follow the money, sort of typical, how do you study politics? And some of it is social, right? It's like, who is at the dinner with whom and who is married to whom? neoconservatism especially has like a run on families. Like people married each other, their kids became directors of organizations. And the same, to some extent, is true within the world of Zionist policy and organizations in the US and their connections to the Israeli state. Some of it is much more concrete. For example, the ADL has a program, many programs, I think, on tech, big tech, and like monitoring the internet and promoting, tech solutions. And the Israeli tech industry is, of course, quite central to the government and to the economy. It's a place where there are lots of ex-military figures running tech companies, and they're ideologically aligned with Zionism and militarism. So there are many, many nodes of connection between the ADL and the Israeli state. The ADL has historically seen its role in the Israel lobby as interpreting Israel to the US public, but also obviously doing so in a moral register, right? There were other organizations in the Israel lobby whose job it was to promote the idea that supporting Israel is a matter of security for the United States. That's not the ADL's, or it hasn't been the ADL's job, although it also does that. Its job has been to make sort of the moral and civil rights-based case for it. So it has those sort of connections. It's also directly involved in strategizing how to shift American public opinion on Israel. There's a report, which I'll get the link and I'll drop it in the chat. It's called the 20X problem. Can't remember what year it's from, 2018 maybe, which was written by the ADL and the Israeli think tank, the Rayut Institute. And it looks at Black Lives Matter and the No DAPL movement, the No Pipeline movement, to try and understand like why, given that Zionist organizations have increased their funding for Hasbara by 20 times. Like, why do Americans seem to still think that Black people and Indigenous people are like Palestinians in their relationship to power rather than Zionists, rather than Jews? How can we make this intervention? We also, I mean, that kind of same logic appears in the formation of the Lawfare Project, which is the avowedly right-wing Zionist legal attack organization that seeks to use civil rights law to attack Palestine solidarity and formulate all kinds of repression. That organization was formed literally with the question, how can we do for Zionism what Black Lives Matter did? So these are all kind of a piece, and the ADL's role with the Israeli government, its Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which is Hasbara industry, is quite direct, and the pathways for that are pretty straight from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to like Jonathan Greenblatt going on MSNBC twice a week to talk about anti-Semitism.
Okay, but then the second part of that question is really, really hard. It's like, okay, quote, liberal Zionists are seeing what Israel isn't doing in Gaza and they feel really bad, right? And they're committed liberal Zionists. So I think people here may want to know, like, how can they think about and talk about and, push people who are aligned in some ways, but not in other very important ways?
I don't know how to talk to people who still think Zionism is a good idea, honestly. And I don't seek it out. I feel like the information is there, right? There is so much information. It honestly feels to me like willful refusal. And there is, maybe Jessie can speak to the idea of like Zionist fragility, which I think so closely mirrors our conversations about white fragility. I had a conversation the other day with a neighbor at our dog run. He had been interested in, we had had a sort of abstract conversation. He was interested in the book. He had looked at my website, and the next day when I went to speak with him, he told me that in fact he had been the director of a Zionist organization, and he wanted to tell me a story about how his Zionist organization had helped a Palestinian baby get from Gaza into Israel to receive health care. And I listened, I tried so hard to listen without expression. And after he got about 5 minutes into it, at one point I just tipped my head. I was like, there was a detail. He was like, I was like, really? And he shut down, right? He was like, well, you don't believe me. I'm not going to tell you the rest of my story. It's like, I didn't believe anything you said up until now, but now it's the time when I like indicated that there might be some question. And he simply walked away. He refused to have a conversation. I don't know how to have a conversation with somebody who still thinks that if they're, if they're talking to me about like something great they did at a checkpoint, but they don't want to think about why there's a checkpoint, like I just can't help, I don't know what to
There's
say.
yeah, I'll just jump in and say that there's a whole, I don't know if the people on this call are familiar with, I'm gonna lose her name. She has a wonderful book out called Calling In, and she's at Smith College, and her name has just flown my brain, but I will come back to it. Loretta Ross. Thank you very much. Anyway, and she has a book called Calling In, and her whole program is about we don't cancel each other, we talk to each other, and we try to invite each other in. And this has really informed a lot of the work that I do in one of my political homes, which is called Showing Up for Racial Justice, Surge. I'm on something called the Calling In team, where we practice doing this with each other. But I tell you, similar to what Emmaia just shared, I had a really good friend who really, it seemed like out of nowhere, sent me a text just in the last 6 weeks or so and said, I'm not a Zionist, but I think the Jews should get the land. I just, LOL, not to start a fight, but Jews get the land is Zionism. And we are no longer friends because she could not have that conversation with me about, what words mean. And so I think there is a way in which we have to get more nuanced about how we talk to each other and recognize when, if people are not listening, that you're not having a conversation anymore. Something else is at play. And then I think you have to walk away, which is what I did, what Emmaia did. There's just a point at which you go, okay, we are not listening to each other and having a conversation in that sense. Something else is going on. And I wish you well.
What a perfect segue to the action steps in the last 5 minutes. Because while we all know those people who want to hold on to liberal Zionism or Jews want to, whatever, we all know those people. Believe me, are far greater number of people out there who are thinking something isn't right here. I want to understand and I want to do something. They're not connected perhaps to analysis and frameworks, and more importantly to movements, because every single person here, and there are still 98 people here, if you do like a network mapping, right, each person is connected to so many different networks. It could be school, it could be work, it could be, your alumni people, it could be the parents of your children's friends. All of us are connected. And within those networks, there are massive numbers of people who are not happy, who believe that all people ought to be liberated, that we all ought to have the ability to speak our ideas without being accused of being hateful and not losing our jobs for it, or being slandered or doxxed, etc. So I think that as frustrating as it may be for those of us who do have those people in our lives, and as frustrating as it is to grasp that here, 3 years into a genocide, we're still trying to say, oh no, Palestinians are human beings and ought not to be slaughtered and eliminated from the face of the earth. Even though it's frustrating to be where we are, there are tremendous opportunities for every single person here and for all of us to do activism that actually matters. And so I, as an activist and as an organizer with Drop the ADL from Schools, want to say that I have no idea how to do this thing that we're trying to do. I don't know. I don't know. If there was a blueprint, I would just give it to you. What I do know from my experience in the last couple of years being connected to organizers and non-organizers, regular people, educators, students, parents, etc., in communities around the country, is that when we share information about what's happening in our sphere, about what we see, how we see the ADL showing up. Oh, I see them doing this. Oh, I see this. Oh, I see that happening. Oh, there's curriculum. Oh, the police came, whatever. We share that information. We are learning more and more about the strategy they're using and having stronger networks to push back against them. So I wish that I could tell you, here's the 3 steps you could take. I don't know, but we certainly at Drop the ADL from Schools want you all to not consider the ADL statistics credible and to promote that idea among consumers of media and the producers of media. The ADL is not a credible source. It's not a neutral source on any topic, not on racism or bias or anti-Semitism or anything, period. We also want to not allow the ADL to bring carceral quote solutions into schools or communities. We don't want the ADL running events where the police come and talk to us about how hate has to be fought with violence from the police. So these are just a couple of things at the end of our time, and I will ask you all to make among your action steps signing the petition to the media, signing the open letter to get the ADL out of schools, promoting, participating in these movements, promoting these movements, and to providing information to us about what you see in your local communities. I've really learned a lot today. I am so grateful to those of you who put huge amounts of work at the expense of yourself and your family into books like this that change the landscape within which we can talk and work as scholars and activists. And to those of you who've stayed through the end of this webinar, to the co-sponsors of this event who do ongoing work for liberation in different spheres and have come together today to do it together. And also, I have to say, to Palestinians who are staying alive, continuing to feel joy and to demand the opportunity to live fully. They are an ongoing inspiration, as are you. Thank you so, so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Emmaia, and thanks, Jessie. And thanks to all of you.
Pleasure. Thanks so much.